Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Jones. I'm from the New School in New York City. I work with these esteemed fellows, Sebastian Hammer, Nettie Legassi, and Rob Carolano from Columbia University. Um, we're all part of the Controlled Digital Lending Interoperability Working Group with NISO, in case you were wondering why the four of us are up in front of here. I will be your semi-game show host as well. There's some construction paper in front of you. So we found the exercise that we're going to have at the end of this session to be quite instructive and actually quite educational. So we decided to replicate this for this session. I also want to thank the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring the work that we've done up to this point in writing the report, in having the conversations, as well as really looking at some of the problems that we were actually going to have as different types of controlled digital lending systems started to emerge, particularly after COVID. I just want to, as an aside, point to this image that's off to the right here. I actually found this image, and it's quite astounding when it comes to thinking about different ways that we encounter text within, whether it's digital or electronic. And the point of this image is not just that controlled digital lending is a new way of encountering this text, but it's also that there's a whole bunch of physical material around this person that they would never know about if it wasn't actually digital. So just to give you guys a little bit of context, unfortunately with the screen as washed out as it is, controlled digital lending is not new. It's actually been going on since 2008 with some of the work that the Hadi Trust has done. And the Big Ten Alliance, it really began to gain some conceptual momentum back in 2011 with Michelle Wu writing a paper on the notion of how collective collections actually expand and how digital surrogates could actually be loaned. It's the first instance of the concept of own to loan, which we'll be talking about quite a bit within the literature. And Michelle, being the former director for Georgetown Law Library, was really one of the first people who thought about what the legal basis was actually going to be for this practice. At the same time, Internet Archive in the same year opened the Open Library. We all know about that. And if you want to actually talk about some of the legal impacts, there's another presentation going on. We're here to actually talk about the technology of it and how this actually works. After that, fast forward to 2018, there's the Controlled Digital Lending white paper that brought a number of different professionals, both from the legal perspective, from access services, from a lot of different ARL libraries, as well as the first signatory list or letters of support actually around this practice. So the real lightning rod behind this white paper wasn't just that it worked out a conceptual framework for controlled digital lending. It was actually one of the first places that showed the widespread support that was actually in the library industry for what this practice is and where it could actually go. Whoops. After that, we all know we had the COVID pandemic. A whole bunch of things were basically closed as a result of this. How it affected courses, how it affected access to material. Ironically enough, in this closing, there was a tremendous amount of innovation that actually happened from a lot of startups, whether this be a small company like FileOpen, for example, that was shuttling PDFs around. There were things that happened with Box, with Google Drive, with OneDrive. I mean, there were any number of different approaches in how to do this. This really was one of the first, this crisis in a way actually created the context for how controlled digital lending may actually be executed by different types of access services groups. Oops. And then you have the group actually launched that's actually going to be talking a little bit, not just about these systems and how controlled digital lending happens, but more importantly, how do you actually do something like interlibrary loan where two different CDL systems actually have to potentially talk to one another so that a patron in one institution could actually look at the material within a CDL application from another. Now, one of the first things that actually is kind of evolving out of the work of the NISO group is this classification of different models of controlled digital lending systems. The first is what's traditionally known as standalone. And this is something that we've basically been doing for quite some time, course reserves. We're actually taking the material off of the shelf. We're putting it behind the shelf. Some may actually say sequestering it. But instead of actually making it available for a short-term loan, we're actually digitizing the material and putting those scans or those assets into a digital asset management system. The second is an institutional type of model where these scans are basically in a localized store, but then they're actually connected to the circulation system itself. So if somebody has actually checked out the physical book, the link to the controlled digital lending object is actually suppressed. So you maintain that one-on-one relationship basically with an institutional model. The consortial model, on the other hand, actually expands that so that not only are you looking at an institutional copy of the book, but you could actually look at suppressing or sequestering that book from another library instead of just your own. So you could effectively look at the number of copies that are available to the network to be the total number of copies that are available in the consortium. The centralized model is something that's emerging where if you can kind of think about rapid ILL, there is no logical sense of groups. This is actually one large system that a number of institutions belong to, and each has access to the other's material in a very kind of service-oriented type of way. But there are no other, the two differences between these models. Within the consortial model, the community actually owns the code as well as the infrastructure. In the vended model, it's actually a vendor that actually operates those service level agreements as well as the materials. And then finally, there's another model that's emerging that looks like something that OCLC and others are going to be looking at, which is actually a broker model. And in that model, they're not actually doing any of the storing, but they're actually managing the transactions between the controlled digital lending systems. So these are the models that we've heard about, that we've seen as part of the environmental scan. And we're sure that there are going to be different types of hybrids or mixing or matching of different kind of traits with these models as well. A few things about controlled digital lending. It is the practice of where libraries are lending digital surrogates of print material or their print holdings. However, and I think this is something that's really important, that does not necessarily preclude that different types of either licensed or open access or other types of materials couldn't use the same systems or the same delivery channels to do this. What we're really focusing on right now is what the kind of traditional or classic model is in terms of this kind of own-to-loan system, where we're actually trying to maintain the print as well as the electronic and keep those numbers in sync. We're also talking about how the wait list actually happens if a book is actually busy, okay? So the other part that I think is really important, particularly within kind of your more classic or traditional controlled digital lending systems, is the notion that there are access controls. This isn't something that has an unlimited license. There are a limited number of concurrent users that can have this. But we really do need to look at both the authentication systems that actually grant access to this. It's not freely available to everybody, but maybe to people within my particular community. And then how does that look if you're actually sharing these between institutions? Because if Seb's in one institution and he has one set of single sign-on credentials and I have another, and his library wants to loan me something, I'm not going to get Seb's credentials. I have to figure out a mechanism to actually exchange those and make that available. So with that, I'm going to drop off to have Nitty.
Thanks, Alan. All right, so I just have a few slides to talk about NISO and how the project got to us. I hope you've heard of NISO. We are a standards and recommended practices development organization, and we provide support for so many of the connections that grease the wheels between different systems. In general, standards overall, they can be used to make sure things work together, as Alan described. We want to be sure that the systems are going to be able to communicate with each other. In general, standards also ensure that things are working or done the same way so that people can know what to expect when they need to implement something. If something is standardized, you at least have a baseline for how you might proceed yourself, and it gives you a leg up in moving forward, both for you as a user and for any company that implements a standard, then they can build on top of that. And then ultimately, though, I think standards are important to build trust between suppliers and customers and people in an environment. Standards help us all trust that things are happening in an appropriate way. And I think we've talked about trust a lot at this conference, so I'm sure you're thinking about it too. NISO in general create, publish, and maintain standards and recommended practices. The CDL work is going to be a recommended practice when we publish it. And we also foster adoption. So after something is published, we also convene groups that help support it, talk about it like we are today, help train people on different aspects of those things, and then also keep the wheels spinning by incubating thought leadership activities. One of those is our NISO Plus conference, which takes place online in February. That's actually how this project got started, was at discussions at NISO Plus in 2021. We had a session on controlled digital lending, and there was a very lively discussion about the gaps and the needs, and that then came forward to a proposal that was put to the Mellon Foundation. As Alan mentioned, the Mellon Foundation has provided funding to help support the development of this work. And we have created a proposal to the NISO voting membership about this, which is then, according to our development slide, NISO receives a proposal, as we did. The voting members approve it. We have formed a working group. That was done at the beginning of this year. So about a year ago, we were gathering people and had the first meeting of the working group in January. And then working through the last, the 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock is the development work of the group where we are now, pulling together the background, the different inputs that we need to draft an output, which is happening now. And we hope that we'll have public review early in the year and moving on in the cycle. The NISO working group, I'm sure it's very small, but this is on our website where you can see, give credit to all the people who are participating from different libraries, different systems, different inputs. And then our timetable is in general, as I mentioned, and also, boy, this projector is very faded, but we're in November, as you probably know, and we've been doing the information gathering and drafting right now. So that's the work that's going on now, is drafting, pulling all that stuff together, figuring out the gaps that we still need to fill, and then moving it toward a public comment period, which is currently projected for February. And I think that's it for me. Next person.
Thanks, Nettie. Hi, everybody. I'm Sebastian Hammer. I'm one of the co-founders of a software company called Index Data. We make software with libraries and collaborative projects and such. And I want to talk about some of the specifics of the types of standards that we're looking at. But before I do that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about why I volunteer my time to this project and why I think the work of NISO is so very important and why you should care about it. So my very first adult job, about 32 years ago, my first day of my first job, my boss gave me a pamphlet and said, this is what we live by. Take this and learn it and become comfortable with it. And it wasn't an employee handbook. It was a standard from the International Standards Organization called ISO 2709. Over here, I was in Denmark, I'm a Dane. Over here, it would be known as Z39.2. It is the rules for how you take a Mark 2021 record and encode it on magnetic tape. And I was deeply troubled by this. I took this pamphlet home and I didn't understand it. I thought I could not see the point of it, and I nearly quit my job, but I didn't. And that standard has lived with me ever since then. It's actually, one of NETI's. It comes out of NISO as well. And it was magnetic tapes are long gone at this point, but the same standard governs how Mark 21 records, Mark 22, is it? Mark records are exchanged on the internet every day. Give thoughts to how many billions of records are passing back and forth between countries and systems every day. And as much as everybody knows there are issues with Mark, reflect on how much worse this world would be if bibliographic metadata was whatever your vendor says it is, whatever your country says it is, whatever this project says it is, whatever your book supplier decides metadata is, right? If there's no framework for us to speak together about what bibliographic metadata is. It was a huge revolution back then when it kind of codified the migration from physical library cards into something electronic, and it is incredibly important today. Something similar, there's a parallel that you can draw to what is happening with CDL as an emergent field, right? The thing I have observed most of all over the past 32 years as a computer programmer, and as my perspective has evolved from just solving the problem of getting from point A to point B with code into thinking about the life cycle of software. I've written software, I've been part of writing software that has gone on and had successful lifespans of 20, 25 years, and that have ended up, just like Mark, being used in completely different ways than we imagined 20 years ago today. Recombining, adding, building on things. From my perspective, standards are the type of glue and interaction points that enable software to take on life beyond the imagination of the original creators. It's what turns our software components into Lego bricks that can be built up and combined in new ways. And I've made it a point as I worked over the years to incorporate standards like ISO 2709 and others into my work. And I've been really lucky to get to work with some of the people who create those standards. It also has informed me as I was designing software. It's helped shape projects that I've worked on. I've been able to look at standards governing the space and kind of stepped in the footsteps of other people who've gone before me. And that's been incredibly important to me. So with that out of the way, the things that we're looking at in this project in terms of modeling what CDL means, of kind of taking the step from the description of controlled digital lending and the white paper and the conversations that's gone before and the prototyping that's taken place in a lot of different places during the pandemic. We've tried to model out what a kind of complete CDL system might look like in a library. Knowing that not every CDL system would have all of these different components. We've seen a lot of CDL systems that were focused on emergency access to course reserves, where you take a stack of books off the shelf and you kind of remove them from the library management system and you put them into a separate system that you've homegrown or you bought somewhere, and that's your system. So it doesn't need a lot of interactions with other systems. But if we imagine CDL as something that you can apply not only for collaboration between libraries, but to manage access to your whole collection potentially, we need to start thinking about interactions with other systems, with your inventory management system, with access control systems, and with the way you handle physical materials and the way that you provide access to digital materials. So some of the components that we think of, some of the problems that we have to solve is we have to think about how to receive requests from an external discovery layer. What does a request for CDL look like? How does it match up against other types of requests for other types of materials, digital, physical? So we think in terms of standards like OpenUL that might let you get from a discovery layer into a CDL system, if you will. We need to do things like authenticate and authorize the patron. We need to know that the patron making that request is actually a proper person. We need to determine whether that request is applicable to CDL. Once you move beyond cost reserves into your general collection, you need to have models and practices for determining which part of your collection might be applicable for CDL. And this may change over time. Pandemics may come along and completely change the way that you provide access to your collection, right? You need to do things like manage your own-to-loan ratio, as Alan talked about. How do you manage that? How do you interact with the circulation system in your library to make sure that you have physical copies in your collection to represent or to match the digital loans that you make? You need to manage digital assets. You need to access scanning workflows and scanning processes. You need to figure out how to provide controlled access to those digital files. And all of these different pieces, you may construct in very different ways, but each one of them potentially opens up a discussion about APIs and interactions. Going out a step further and thinking in terms of collaboration and being able to spread the workload of doing CDL in a consortial setting, being able to work together as libraries to share access to collections, both in terms of digital files, the creation and management of them, but also in terms of the physical collections that underlie, that form the basis for the own-to-loan calculation that enables access to these materials. You can imagine scenarios that are hyper-centralized, right, where a group of libraries all share exactly the same software platform. They have a central patron database, they're all running the same ILS, they're all running the same digital asset management system at one extreme. And then at the other extreme, you can imagine open-ended ILL with loosely coupled libraries that decide to do interlending digitally in addition to physically. What are the mechanisms that need to be in play? What are the standards that might be used in between those two extremes? So we think about pieces like consortial request brokering systems. How do you pass requests back and forth between libraries? How do we extend traditional ILL in an open-ended way to incorporate digital lending as well? Shared directory services to represent what different libraries make available, their policies and so on. Shared delivery platforms. You know, Alan already talked about the challenges of access control when different libraries are running different types of digital rights management systems and so on. So these are all the different facets that we're trying to look at, surveying the community and trying to make recommendations to guide further development, but also acquisitions and technology choices by libraries, trying to make CDL sort of an everyday part of how libraries do business, and to have that conversation be owned by all of us, not by any one vendor. So that's why I think this is important. And over to Rob.
Thanks, Sebastian. My name is Robert Cartolano. I'm from Columbia University Libraries. And we've talked a little bit about what CDL is and how we might implement this. From the library perspective, why does this all matter? Well, starting from the very top, the first thing we want to do is foster always discovery and access to our collections, and CDL can foster new ways to provide access at its very heart. But as was mentioned, we are concerned that there could be many, many different potential models that might serve a single library, a local library, or consortial library, but we want to avoid a potential Tower of Babel between vendors. And we're very specifically concerned about some early entries by proprietary vendor-based solutions that might create essentially proprietary vendor networks of CDL, which might work great for a single institution or a small group of institutions, but won't really provide the level of collaboration that we might want for the ways libraries share our knowledge among each other for serving our users. And so that's why this concept of standards that was brought up earlier is so important for us. So we really want to, through this effort, to recommend approaches that would allow for our vendors to create solutions that in fact are openly accessible and usable, so that the information can flow between them, and that if necessary, it could be from one library to another library or one consortia to another consortia. And at the heart of this supports our core library values, to really foster access and service at the highest level. I mean, that's what we're here for. So, you might say, well, why do we need why not just use a proprietary solution? Why not look at just a single point solution? And why look at open solutions? And, as was mentioned with the MARC standard, an open solution really provides a more sustainable, long-term ability for libraries to deliver services as technologies evolve, services evolve, administrations of libraries evolve, even national organizations and consortia evolve. These standards can evolve as well. And by keeping it open, we think the solution will evolve over time and will not be stuck in a particular technology rut or stuck behind a particular point solution from a vendor that might render it perhaps obsolete earlier than we would like it. So to be more cost effective, I think you have to be more open. And finally, by being open, we have the chance to provide a consistent library experience for our users. And we want to make sure that our users are really at the heart of this. So looking at their perspective, we want to make sure that they have a consistent reading experience when we think about CDL as a service, and to avoid a fragmented approach in obtaining, providing access to, and then ultimately allowing our users to read those books. So, to that end, CDL should be interoperable with other forms of digital lending. It's not just CDL as a solution, and then you have to go to a different technology solution for another type of service, for example, course reserves. CDL should be interoperable with all the other forms of digital lending because we want to be user-centric. We don't want our users to have to go through different technology or service silos to find books that might be licensed over here, open access over there, and CDL over there. So we want to make sure that CDL is interoperable with lending approaches that might include purchased or licensed books, open access books, or even our restricted special collections. And we think by doing so, this will support new forms of collaboration with our publishers and with our ebook providers, to support new types of scholarship that might come out of these resources that are now available, that might have been previously constrained because that information was tied up in a physical book. Perhaps making it more available and more discoverable and more usable might foster new forms of scholarship. So we've spent a little bit of time thinking about, should we focus on controlled digital lending at the institution level? Or should we focus at the heart as a consortial and kind of a lending across institutions level, or should we focus on both? We think that you could move pretty quickly to do an institutional only approach, but that could result in silos of access. So I think, have more or less, I would say we've converged together as a group that we need to do both. We need to have a controlled digital lending set of recommendations that can support both local and institutional. And our committee will recommend standards and practices to support solutions that can meet both local and consortial needs. We've talked a bit about future-proofing, and it's impossible to future-proof any type of recommendation. And all of these recommendations, as was mentioned earlier, they evolve and they change. But we're trying to think ahead as much as possible, so that we have, maybe anticipating some of the potential future needs, while also balancing not over-engineering and over-designing it to make it overly complex. And this is, I think, the heart of probably our next 4 or 5 months of work to try to strike that right balance. Now, as libraries, we might already have some examples and some use cases, and these are ones that have been identified to us already. Course reserves, clearly an example that some of us are already using CDL for. Just providing discovery and access to physical books as electronic books within a single institution. working across institutions to provide services, and those could be provided potentially at a national level, electronic ILL or EILL service. So I'm going to pass it on back to Alan, and this is the fun part, we hope. So we're going to take it all back to you. So let's see where this takes us. And I think you take this last.
All right, everybody, get your construction paper ready. As I said, this was, oops, where's the cursor? As I said, this is a game that we wound up playing with the committee, and I think it actually really helped us clarify what the definition of controlled digital lending was, where the different applications may actually overlap, and what was definitely not CDL. So the game is called CDL, not CDL, or CDL adjacent. And as you can imagine, you have construction paper that's one of each different type of traffic light. Whoops. Red basically being not CDL, yellow being CDL adjacent, which as we frame it basically is it's the same delivery channel as CDL, but it isn't necessarily what we would consider traditional CDL. And then green is actually CDL. So first use case that was actually presented to this group was DRM-free ebooks that are being emailed back and forth to patrons for interlibrary lending. Is that considered CDL? Okay, this actually took us about 5 months to get through. So, no, keep them up. Okay, I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind here with respect to CDL. The first is that does that particular DRM free have any kind of access controls on it? In which case, it's probably not CDL. Because one of the things that we're thinking about with CDL is the need to have these types of access controls. Once that patron actually is emailed that DRM-free ebook, they could forward that on to whomever they want. So the point basically is that the ability to copy that file has basically left the library or left the building literally once it goes to that other patron. So this was something that, again, you'd think it was kind of easy, but it actually, there are a number of different stipulations that will actually limit some of the discussion. Scanning a single copy of a print text and making it available to enrolled students in a one-on-one basis. Students will be able to read the text, but not copy or paste it or print it. And the single text sits behind the circ desk, unable to be checked out. I see a sea of green. That is, by far and away, the most traditional sense of CDL. Thank you, everyone. Here's another question. A library has a plan of distributing open access materials via their mobile app. So there is no copyright or copyright concerns with respect to this or copyright restrictions, but they do want to use the channel that they're distributing their scanned material for this open access material. Would you consider that CDL? CDL adjacent. I see a sea of yellow. I'm curious, why would you say it's not CDL, Stacy?
Because of the nature of the material, because it's open access, it seems to me. I'm not CDL, I don't know.
I'm sorry? Right, they don't need to use the app, but the point here was they decided to actually use the same app that distributed the controlled material. And one of the things that's going to be really important about CDL systems is that they can both handle material that doesn't have those restrictions and material that does. Yes.
All right, Brian, now I have a question about the DRM3 and open access.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, you had said that that was not CDL, but now it seems like it might have been CDL. What's the answer?
No, the answer to that was that it was not CDL. And the reason was that it was outside of a system that had any kind of access constraints whatsoever. They were actually using email. Exactly. The whole point behind thinking about CDL is that there are these access controls, and then there's the question of, do you actually sync those access controls with your physical inventory? Now, there may be those things that have different rights scenarios that could be delivered through those channels. That's CDL adjacent, okay? The traditional model basically keeps physical material and digital circulation very tightly integrated. CDL adjacent may not. Oops. So for this would be CDL adjacent. Yes. Mm-hmm. That's correct. It's the delivery channel. No, it doesn't. And let me tell you why. And it actually goes back to my introduction before. We've been doing the sequestering of material for centuries. We just now are doing it in a way that's actually tied to our inventory management system and our digital asset management system. I actually made this point in another session. We've all had digital asset managements. We've all had physical asset management systems. The major kind of evolution of CDL is that those two systems actually talk to one another. That's it. Yeah.
One thing to note is that it is possible for the library to provide another way to distribute this content as a straight download, for example, off of a web page. So it doesn't preclude the library from providing another means of access, which would be a not CDL approach, including the earlier, right? So the same file could be emailed. That same file could be available as a download. It's this restriction through this mechanism where we're saying it's CDL adjacent. So, and it's typical that in our system, sometimes we may have 2 or 3 different ways to access a certain file.
One thought I would offer too. I think the game show is interesting, both to show how much fun it is to volunteer for NISO, but also we used the game show, and we didn't. This wasn't the majority of our work, to be fair. But we had spent a ton of time arguing about these things, and one of the things the game show helped us realize was that there are kind of 2 ways of looking at CDL, depending on which side of the wall you sit on, outside of the library and inside. And it was hard. We found ourselves confusing the patron experience and the internal library workflows. And
Right.
this helped really clarify that the ultimate purpose of this was to understand that our job here is to deliver a unified experience to the patron as much as possible, no matter where they are, no matter what type of thing it is behind this. They don't care. We're not going to teach the patrons what CDL is. But we may have these different types of workflows going on behind the scenes, and understanding that boundary was really what this exercise was about.
Absolutely. So we've got about 3 or 4 minutes for a couple of other scenarios. 5 minutes left? Okay. But I want to leave a couple minutes for questions. With respect to licensed ebooks, can also be distributed through a mobile application, or if the number of concurrent users are reached, my application creates a wait list and the patron will be notified when an ebook is available for use. My app allows the patron to do everything that the publisher's interface does in terms of note-taking, downloading, etc. Is that considered CDL? this was one of the major conflicts that our group actually had. And part of this actually had to do with the fact that in most CDL, we're talking about library-generated content as opposed to vendor-generated content being delivered through that channel. So in this particular case, it's considered CDL adjacent. Stacy? Oh, you got one right. A library has the idea to digitize a video and make it available to its patrons in a one copy, one person basis. So now we're not talking books anymore, we're talking video. Patrons can't grab screen captures or video feeds from the platform. What is that? Yes, it doesn't have to be a book. It doesn't have to be a book in order for it to be CDL. You're absolutely right. In fact, that was actually a question that's come up in terms of time-based media and whether it's actually eligible for CDL. Now, that goes to say everything is based on risk assessment of your institution. So if, you know, the edict from my general counsel is always, who has more lawyers? So we tend to be pretty conservative. So always, as you're beginning to think about these implementations, be in conversation with your general counsels or any kind of legal review that you actually may need in order to implement this. Yep. Yeah, the slides are going to be available as well. A requesting library from another state wants access to a digital copy of a print item in our collection. I'm going to twist this in a second. It would be considered CDL, and it would be considered interlibrary lending through CDL. However, let's ask the question, what if it was from another country? And the same intellectual property law didn't apply to that company or to that country as the one here. This is actually one of the problems that we're dealing with right now when it comes to not only how do you communicate the rights and responsibilities of the lender and the supplier within the actual requests that are coming into and out of our interlibrary lending systems. I think I've solved our permission problem. Our library would like to purchase one copy of a set of articles for a course reader and then limit access to the digital course packet. If Kyle Courtney was here, he would tear me a new one, but that's a whole other thing. Not CDL. Anything that's licensed, even though you're restricting access to it, you have to follow the terms of the license. License always trumps copyright or defense of fair use. Okay, fair enough. I am assuming, and maybe this is because I've been in the permissions business too long, that every time I purchase an article and a license comes with it. So I'll take that. That's on me. So those are the scenarios and the types of things that the CDL group actually looks at and works on. I just wanted to open up and see if there are any other questions. We've got a minute or two, but yeah, in the red.
Hello. Is it on? Yes. Okay. Lucy Harrison, Galileo. So we're not doing anything with CDL at the consortial level right now. We're just getting our toes wet. But I'm interested in the limitations on printing, downloading. Is that baked in from the start with CDL, or is that just something you're assuming would be problematic? I mean, because it seems like fair use and copyright would allow for that to some extent, even within CDL.
No, actually, the printing and the downloading, et cetera, is not necessarily, I think this actually brings up a real interesting question as far as what the role is for document delivery in these types of situations. And I have a very big concern that controlled digital lending will lead to the end of document delivery, but we could go on for hours about that. But I think that again, that functionality is all about risk assessment and what the institution is willing to do and what it isn't. There was kind of a red herring, actually. So printing and downloading and user behavior is really what the level of the comfort of the institution is. There may be specific limits, like you may say, I don't know, the 10% or whatever your institution calls fair use, although it's very arguable whether percentage actually makes sense from a legal point of view. It may from a policy point of view, just to make it easy to process requests. But there's nothing in the law that preludes that from happening.
I just add that, there might become standards of practice about
Yes.
about downloads. So far, all of the CDL implementations that we've seen have you reading the material, not necessarily taking a full download of the entire item for perhaps additional reproduction. So that's something that we've seen as a standard of practice. Whether we make that as part of our recommendations, I think is probably we're still on that fence. We'd love to hear your feedback on that.
The other thing I'll also say is that accessibility also brings up a whole other set of challenges to this, particularly around copying and pasting and text-to-speech engines. That potentially opens up a different type of transformative use, because now if I have the full text available in these documents, could I theoretically harvest this, search it, and create new scholarship, as Rob was saying? I mean, I think there are some really interesting, potentially transformative uses to CDL that are different in kind than just the access channel of physical to electronic. And I think those are things that we have to pursue. Yeah, one more question.
Rob Thiessen, University of Calgary. My institution is very skittish about CDL because of the National Emergency Library lawsuit, even though we aren't in the United States. So just going back to your game show analogy, where would you put that, red light, green light, yellow light?
Ooh, the Internet Archive. No comment? No.
Okay, no. Okay,
Plead the
fair
fifth? Yeah, I would probably put it adjacent. And the reason that I would is I think that you could argue about the lack of, I think there's two different issues here. The first issue is open library versus emergency library. I think that those are two very different scenarios, and we have to tease those out. With respect to the emergency library, I would tend more to the yellow, or yeah, probably somewhere in the yellow. However, with the open library, where there are a certain number of limited copies that are available, I would consider that much more green than I would even yellow. And so I think, in fact, I think the success of the open library is because it has been around that traditional CDL model. One of the things I'm concerned about with a lawsuit is the collusion of these two use cases, which I think is a very scary situation, because it potentially has impacts for all controlled digital lending as opposed to those two different scenarios.
But there'll be years of court appeals on that exact conversation. So
Yeah.
we'll have to watch and see.
I mean, one of the things that Kyle Courtney from Harvard actually said was it took 12 years for the e-reserves case to really resolve itself. And I think we're going to be in a similar type of waiting scenario. And for those reasons, that's part of the need for risk assessment by each institution. So, okay, everybody, we are over time. I want to thank you as being the last of the last. You all are amazing troopers. I hope it's been a great conference. I want to thank the panel here. So thank you, everyone.